Alright, we're here today at ICHK in Hong Kong, and we're going to talk about question number 5 today. Given that every theory has its limitations, we need to retain a multiplicity of theories to understand the world. Discuss this claim with reference to 2 areas of knowledge. Well, joining us today are teachers from ICHK. And Mr. Edwards, from a science perspective, is over there, natural sciences. Mr. Chan is going to be talking about religious knowledge systems. Mr. Hall, about history, and Ms. Chan, psychology. I'm a teacher of literature as well as TOK. Literature is classified under the arts, so I'll talk about that as well. So this question, to me, intuitively, intuitively I might disagree with that. It seems that if you've got a theory about something, that theory should be rigid. It should be like based on fundamental, agreed, shared knowledge. So yeah, my first impressions were no. I would disagree with that title. But then I got to thinking about it as a literature teacher, and I reckon that there may be like a perspective in literature where we can think about the multiple different critical perspectives you might take. So I'm just going to frame this with a bit of like art history. So, Liz. Right, so behind us are classical examples of architecture. I don't know if they're Greek or Roman, they're a mixture of them. But within these beautiful examples of archaeological wonders, there's a golden ratio at work here, which is all part of the classical standard of beauty. On the next slide, this is Michelangelo's Davids. This is from the Renaissance. So, a couple of thousand years later, the Italian philosophers, artists, and engineers are going back to this as the standard of beauty. It's a renaissance, it's a rebirth of ideas. So, we see that again. And then, examples of Hellenic statues built with this. They're beautiful because they're 2,000 years old. They've got this amazing sense of proportion. They are the ideal standard of beauty. This is how you sculpt. There's a certain way to paint. There's a certain way to think, and that is the classical idea. We see that actually in today's world with examples of this. Thank you. So like neoclassical architecture, there's the US Supreme Court, and there's our very own Supreme Court here in Hong Kong. And they're using that classical idea of proportion and scale to say that there is one accepted form of truth. And it used to be that was like the universal accepted way, like this was one way of thinking, and that was truth. And then, I think a really critical date in the historical development of the arts is the First World War. Because before that, in literature, you had grand narratives like Tolstoy, who would understand people's thoughts and feelings with the omniscient narrator. And then countries, colonial powers marching with science and reason underpinning their philosophy. But then it led us to this cataclysmic event of the First World War, where the world shattered itself into a million pieces, and the modernists respond to that. So post-1918, there's the modernist movement, and then there's all of these isms that come from that, like modernism, surrealism, abstract expressionism. James Joyce started to experiment with form, with stream of consciousness writing. So there's an example here in literature how we may actually have a multiplicity of theories, and you may have heard your English literature teachers tell you in literature there's not just one correct answer. It's how you interpret the text, and can you make justifications for your interpretation? If you can, you're on sound grounds. Mr. Evans, can I ask you, in science, can we go back to the question, please, Liz? In science, is it the case that theories have limitations? What kind of limitations do scientific theories have? And does science work towards like one principal theory, or are there a multiplicity of theories in science?
So scientific theories, I think they are designed as organic they'll be developed and they'll be tested, right? One of the groundings behind scientific theories is that you need to perform experiments and do the theories that underpin the current scientific understanding of the world, how do they correspond with the experimental evidence? And if there's experimental evidence to contradict the scientific theories, then they need to be changed or developed further. And so scientific theories are always going to change as time and as science progresses. In terms of a multiplicity of theories, sometimes older scientific theories, like for example Newton's law of gravitation, could actually have been an incomplete theory. But 99% of the time, it does the job. But then if, for example, we begin to think about more complex results of gravitation, then his theory falls down, and then we have to look to a better theory. For example, Einstein's his theory of gravity, right, and the kind of bending of space-time, and more complex results like the gravitational lensing of light, for example, the fact that light can change direction due to the force of gravity. Then we have to go to the more complex theory to help us explain that. So sometimes we can have more than one theory in science that can both have uses, although one might be more complete than the other.
All right, thanks a lot. We were talking in the taxi earlier this morning, as we do, about knowledge questions. So we were saying that quantum physics is maybe an area where there's well, I get the theory of evolution has masses of scientific data in terms of fossils, now carbon dating and things like that. But is it the case in quantum physics or more experimental branches of science, there are hypothetical experiments or theories, or hypothetical theories which aren't able to be tested by experiments?
So there are various, I would say quantum mechanics has been tested quite rigorously, and so that is quite an agreed scientific theory, even though it's quite weird in parts. However, there are also more theoretical branches of physics that can't be tested so easily, and then does that continue to be physics, or is it just metaphysics?
Right. So metaphysics, Mr. Channing. So it might be that a natural scientist who is in a very experimental field, operating in deep space, where they're hypothesizing about different universes or whatever it might be, that there aren't these experiments. So like that sounds to me like to be somewhat unscientific. Maybe like my layman's interpretation of natural science would be, well, hang on, science needs to have evidence to support its claims, and if it doesn't, isn't it kind of repeating what a scientist might point to religion and say, well, look, you haven't got any evidence to support that there is a God or not. So how would a religious, a theologist or a religious person respond to this?
But it's interesting you started out saying that it was quite obvious to you initially, intuitively, that you felt that you disagreed with this statement. Because I came at it the other way. I thought, well, it seems obvious to me when I first look at the question that there has to be, because the world's so vast, there's so many different areas of knowledge that although they're connected with someone, that you need more than just one theory to really understand all the different areas. So you talked about different theories here, but a really elegant theory is the theory of evolution. It's obviously a really important scientific theory, but it also applies to different areas. And you could, for example, look at political sciences and see how the theory of evolution applies also to political systems, right, and how they have evolved over time. You can trace that throughout history. And you can look at many different examples of where evolution would apply outside of just science. Okay? So there are different areas of knowledge there. But actually, there are, as I say, even if you might agree with the overall elegance of such a theory and see that it can apply to many different areas. There's only so much it can tell you. So evolution, it's not going to tell me about how to behave, about ethics, about the right and wrong, and morality of our ethical code. Right? What's the right thing to do with, let's say, take a current situation in Hong Kong and the protests and how to deal with that particular situation. Evolution is not necessarily going to tell me anything about that. Right? So I'll need to have some other theories to really understand the world around me.
Right.
However, thinking about some more back to your original question about a theologian's perspective, there are some fundamentalists who believe that there is only one thing to really know, that God created the world. And as soon as I understand, or a person understands that theory or that fact for that person, then everything else comes with that. So that's the only theory that really is important to that kind of fundamentalist Christian or Muslim.
Yeah, great. I was thinking from English literature, you lot in year 13 studying texts and context will look at how the meaning of a text can change according to culture, according to the reader, according to time. And you're actually going to start to look at the different critical lenses that you can interpret the text by. So you are sculpted in your studies of English literature through the reader response theory. So that's very like a classic interpretation of like characterization, setting, symbols, motifs. You analyse dialogue. Okay, so let's take Hamlet by William Shakespeare. So we can certainly do a reader response theory to Hamlet, but also there are some other lenses. And I think if you think about critical theory in literature as being like a Rubik's cube, and maybe you want to like analyse Hamlet from a psychoanalytic perspective, you can do that. But you can also analyse a text from a Marxist perspective. We can look at the character of Ophelia and go back and do a feminist reading of the text. Psychoanalytic queer theory, many different angles and perspectives, and you'll find these. If you go to an English literature corridor, you'll find in different classrooms professors who have a tendency towards like a favourite approach, but it's not to say that any of those are necessarily correct, although it does provoke debate and dialogue. Mr. Hall, in history, we've got to talk about like historical evidence, things that happen. Can there be like multiple theories in history, or how does that question work?
Well, so I was thinking that within history, theories are destructive. You have a theory of how societies develop, and if you, for example, adhere to the Marxist theory of historical development, it is a theory that is destructive of other theories. You can't have that theory at the same time as you can have other theories about human development. It is a theory that explains everything. So the idea about we need to have a multiplicity of theories to understand the world, that to me says that the question is asking, is there a universal theory that explains everything? And clearly, we've seen that there isn't, because science can only answer so many questions. History and religious knowledge systems will answer another part of that question about why we're here and what's the point of doing what we're doing. So history has a range of theories to explain the past, and they are destructive. You have a theory, it destroys the theory of other theories. You're either a Marxist or you're a capitalist historian who believes that societies develop through the growth of capitalist enterprise. Or you're a Marxist and you believe that it's through who has means of control. So a theory for history exists and it destroys those others.
Right.
Now,
that's different to natural sciences, where you've got someone like Einstein who can develop and extend a theory, not necessarily destroy it. Although is it the case that there might be theories that are destroyed in natural science? Would you use that terminology?
Phlogiston would be one.
Some theories are put aside and left.
The germ theory as well.
While I said earlier that some scientific theories can coexist with each other, I would say that is not the same as saying all theories are equal, right? So we have some theories like the flat Earth theory, which there might be some evidence about that theory, but there's also a lot of evidence to refute that theory. And so, although there are circumstances where we can use older theories which describe the scientific state. Most of the time, there are others that we do need to discard.
So it's the same in history. Grand theories fall down. They can't cover everything. They can't cover every single example because the evidence doesn't fit. They don't work. So theories that would encapsulate, for example, specific events. So, for example, there are theories about the established theories about the Holocaust and how it happened and how many people were killed and the chain of events that led to it. And there are theories put forward by Holocaust deniers that would say that this never happened or it didn't happen in the way that we're saying. Those theories coexist, but it doesn't help us understand the world. And I think that's the important difference there, is that theories are destructive. If you want a whole theory that explains the whole of human development, by default you have to ignore the elements that contradict that, so it's destructive. Theories exist in that some theories can explain some events. So, for example, Russian revolution has a lot to do with the economy, has a lot to do with what Marxists, really classical Marxist views. But other revolutions, other events don't. So they can exist to a certain extent if they're not trying to explain the world and understand the world in its entirety. And if you're talking about between areas of knowledge or across areas of knowledge, then there is no one universal theory. They just don't work. And I think that's probably where the question is on that leading.
And then we also look at this. Human sciences encompasses a broad range of subject areas. Ms. Chan's a psychologist, so Ms. Chan, in psychology, does every theory have its limitations? Are there multiplicity of theories in psychology?
Yes, and I also want to go back to Mr. Evans' point of view of falsification, because he also mentioned about there are different theories explaining different things. And I think if a theory can be falsified, it means it opens up new path to acquire knowledge. And also whether a theory can be testable is very important in psychology, because if you can run an experiment to not try to prove your theory is right, but trying to, improve the theory of understanding our behavior, and I think that is what psychology is trying to do. And today I actually care about memory as one topic of how we understand memory in different theories, using different theories, because memory has been like a black box in our mind, but it's very important because it's how we acquire, understand, and also assess knowledge. So in fact, to 1971, there is a guy called Atkinson and Sharif. They try to understand memory as using a multi-store memory model. So they argue that actually our memory is in 3 separate stores. So that is a theory that opens up path for us to understand, because there is nobody really has studied this black box before. However, it also received a lot of critics, like, but if short-term memory is being rehearsal and it goes to long-term memory, how about emotions? Because sometimes an event happens, you don't really rehearse that event, but you remember very significantly in the back of your mind, right? And also there are theories comes into explain memory, such as level of processing theory. So, people who have shallow processing will have, it doesn't go into your long-term memory unless something that is meaningful. So we have used different theory to look at just in one topic like a memory. So when I read that question, that was very straightforward for me, because I think we have to use different theories to understand one meaning small human behavior.
Right.
We don't have a universal theory to understand human behavior. And also, I believe always encourage that you look at a wide perspective in psychology.
Well, that's great. So we've gone on for nearly 20 minutes now. We could carry on for a lot longer. I think what's important to recognise, though, I think in our response collectively, we've looked at how maybe perspectives of knowledge have changed from this idea of there is some professor in an ivory tower who has all the knowledge, And actually, maybe it's not that case as well, that there's an increasing complexity within subject areas, and that also our knowledge and understanding of the world can benefit if we are aware of the interconnections between different subject areas as well. So thanks very much for taking part, and we'll get at some of the other questions later this week.